welcome back to the Wandering Cantos. Today I wanted to continue our Studio Ghibli little marathon and discuss The Boy and the Heron. So I wanted to start this video as I always do with a quick spoiler warning. This video I'm going to be talking about The Boy and the Heron and fully spoiling it. I'll also likely be talking through comparison about Spirited Away and Howl's Moving Castle. So just little warning there for you, but with that being said, let's jump right into it. I feel like I always start these videos off by saying I don't really know where I should actually start my discussion, and I'm going to be honest, today is no different. This was a much stranger movie than I was expecting. I don't really fully know what I thought because I always intentionally avoid trailers and any sort of discussion. I like to go into movies totally blind. So with this one, just going purely off the title and the little bit I had seen of the promotional poster, I was sort of assuming it would be like a coming-of-age film where a boy meets a magical heron, and the heron is like a nice guiding force, maybe sort of like a grandpa type character. And yeah, it's not like that at all. So basically, to give a brief overview of the plot, you have Mahito, who loses his mom in a fire, and I believe it's sort of like during a bombing raid during World War II. So then he later moves out into the countryside because his father has remarried, and he's actually married his former wife's younger sister, and so he's going back to her family's like estate in the countryside. And this is because Natsuko, who is now his stepmom, is she's pregnant. So she's going to the countryside to sort of rest up with all of that. And immediately there's sort of a mysterious aura to this sort of estate, and this gray heron that flies around Mahito. There's some strange connection between them. And as he's here, he has dreams about his mother, crying out and asking for him to save her from the fire. And he clearly has, some degree of PTSD from the whole experience. But basically, as he's wandering about and sort of following this heron, he eventually comes across a tower. But there's something strange about the tower. The entrance is sort of blocked off, and as soon as he goes, sort of quote unquote missing while he's investigating it, Natsuko and a bunch of these old women who I believe are sort of like servant maids at the house all go looking for him and try to pull him away from the tower. And she reveals that his great uncle went missing in this tower, and he had been reading all these books and was a strange, eccentric character, and basically all that he left behind was the open book of the last book he was reading before he went missing. And so this sort of mystery goes on as the heron and Mahito kind of have a rivalry, and Mahito is sort of getting mocked by the heron, and so he starts to build a bow and arrow. But then they have an encounter. The heron says his mom is actually still alive, and he wants to lead Mahito to her, but it seems like it's a bit of a trap. Fast forward a little bit more, and Natsuko goes missing, and Mahito becomes convinced that she's in the tower. So he goes to the tower, he enters it, he confronts the heron, who actually is sort of like a spiritual entity creature that's kind of like half wearing a heron outfit / still is part heron, sort of a mysterious figure. And then this mysterious master directs the gray heron to bring Mahito to his mom and like to guide him basically. So he then enters this extremely strange and interesting dream world, which I'll talk a bit more about later. But he's like kind of on this strange island, and he eventually goes there. He goes to the parakeet kingdom, There, he meets Himi, who immediately it's hinted at may be his mom, but when she was younger, but she controls fire, which is interesting considering how she appears to die later on. But fast forward some more, and it's revealed that the great uncle is sort of the master of this sort of magical other world, and he is looking for a successor, and he wants Mahito to be it because it has to be someone of his bloodline. And there's this whole sort of abstract image of how you have to stack blocks every 3 days in order to keep sort of like order and this sort of dream world basically sustained. Otherwise it'll collapse. But the Parakeet King, who seemed like a minor character sort of introduced at the end, he ends up messing up these blocks, which causes the world to collapse. So Mahito escapes, returns home, and but having met, and then it's revealed officially that Himi is his mom as the world's collapsing, and so he gets some closure there, and then it basically ends like that he's about to go back to Tokyo, having been changed by his sort of hero's adventure. So that's sort of the most straightforward summary of the plot, I would say, but it's a lot more of an abstract movie when you're actually watching it. A lot of it is sort of strange, and a lot of it leaves you with just a ton of questions. And so I kind of want to discuss some of those questions and give some of my theories and whatnot in this little review, but to sort of just objectively review it in only a couple of words, I would basically say, like, it's a really good movie, and in terms of animation is like a cinematic masterpiece, but there's sort of this weird thing that happens with it where some of the scenes are so subdued and sort of meditative that you can't help but feel a bit bored in them. And I think that boredom is sort of intentional because it lends itself to sort of the strange liminality of the dream magical world that he's in, because a lot of it feels like it's sort of channeling strange liminal spaces and things like that, especially as we see in like classical 19th century art and stuff. So I'm not really talking about like a mall core or like that type of liminal space, the back rooms, but more those sort of paintings you look at that have sort of a quiet emptiness to them. And so in terms of the whole movie as a whole, those sort of quieter, much slower, surrealist moments lend themselves to the overall feeling of being lost in this sort of dream-like other world. But it also sort of makes for, somewhat of a boring viewing experience at parts. I will say I feel like one of my major impressions leaving the theater after seeing this was basically like the movie felt a lot longer than like the 2-hour runtime it is. I've recently seen One Battle After Another, which is also an extremely long movie, but this one felt like so much longer, which again, on the one hand, that sort of length lends itself to the sort of endless dream world type of vibe, but sacrifices are made by creating that effect, let's say. But having only seen this, Spirited Away, and Howl's Moving Castle, I will say that I think this one is deserving of the highest scores out of all of them, but I still feel like if I had to re-watch one of the films, I'd probably want to either re-watch Howl's Moving Castle or Spirited Away more. And I feel like it's hard not to make comparisons between Spirited Away and this one, because they both have to do with a young child entering a sort of surreal, otherworldly space as they deal with sort of emotional struggles having to do with their parents, etc. They're very similar thematically in that way. But yeah, I think that sort of being said, I want to jump more into some of the weirder questions I have and sort of theories and stuff like that. Actually, before I get into all of that, this is sort of a theory thing, but, you know, when you've consumed a lot of literature and, I've taken art courses and things like that, it's pretty common that you find references to different famous pieces of media within movies and things like that. But it was pretty cool because this movie basically references / is inspired by this 19th century painting that I had totally forgotten about until I was watching the movie. And then the way when he's in this sort of dreamy sea island area, following his initial encounter with the gray heron, it's such a strange, like I said, it almost has like that feeling of when you're looking at a painting and it's almost like you can hear the white noise of the painting. If anyone knows what I'm talking about with that, maybe that's a unique experience. But the trees stood out to me because they reminded me of this eerie 19th century painting I'd seen before, which is the Isle of the Dead. And as you can see, he drew a lot of inspiration from this. This totally reminds me of that whole strange area with the gate and the whole like weird tomb of anyone who passes through or ultimately dies, all of that stuff, and these strange tall green trees. And there's just a very eerie atmosphere to sort of this painting. And I feel like obviously the movie had sort of an eerie atmosphere, but it was sort of a fun experience to have this sort of like subliminal, subconscious memory of this painting I'd seen years ago, and seeing as that sort of blended with the dreamy surrealness of the landscape that Mahito goes to, that sort of blending together was sort of a fun and exciting experience, because seeing all of this in the movie made it almost feel like I was seeing a half-remembered dream myself. And I kept being like, I know I've seen a painting like this, but I couldn't remember the specific one. So just wanted to point that out before I get into all of my sort of questions and theories. All right, so I feel like the general vibe with this film was that a lot of it sort of felt like it was stream of consciousness and sort of a subconscious that we sort of see with David Lynch's films. I won't get into spoilers of any of his stuff, but his creative process is that he'll often sort of sit there and meditate and let images sort of flow into his mind, and he'll sort of pluck them out, almost like he's fishing. And then he'll try to use them, and almost meaning is found after the fact, where it'll be like, I didn't realize at the time that purple elephant symbolized X, Y, and Z, that kind of thing. And I felt like a lot of this movie, which is not a critique, it's just a different creative process, I felt like a lot of this movie sort of had that, because there were a lot of parts where I felt like I couldn't come up with a definitive explanation for why certain creative choices were made or what certain things like meant. So for example, first question is, why parakeets? So, on the one hand, I think there's sort of a creative direction explanation, which is basically they're colorful. He's able to design them to be monstrous and big, large and imposing, but also kind of cute, so it's not too scary for younger watchers and things like that. But they played such a big role in the last basically half of the movie that, like, on a more symbolic, thematic sense, I'm wondering, like, what is the importance of parakeets to Mahito? Because when I left, I sort of was only able to say, like, I wonder if the studio basically just thought it would be a beautiful image at the end of the movie when he leaves the tower for suddenly all of these colorful birds to fly out with him, and as all the birds start to land on the lake and fill the air, it's a very, visually interesting moment. But then you have to ask from like a literary symbolic perspective, like, why parakeets, and like why parakeets instead of a bunch of owls, or like canaries are famous for being used in mines to warn miners of, I believe, gas leaks or fires. And so they're like, if it was canaries, you could say, oh, well, maybe he chose that type of bird because of its association with going deep into tunnels and mines and things like that, since Mahito is sort of going down the rabbit hole. But yeah, I don't really know what parakeets might mean to Mahito, because the other thing is, well, the other world is sort of a dreamy, magical world that's brought about by like a meteorite falling down and all of that. But since it is made up, usually from an author's perspective, you usually, if you have someone going down a rabbit hole, the symbolism and the strange imagery within that rabbit hole usually is reflective of a sort of subconsciousness from the person going down the rabbit hole. So without getting into spoilers, we see that a lot in like the Silent Hill games. Usually the monsters and the strange imagery directly connects to the backstory of the protagonist. So with here, I just don't know what the parakeets mean. Two, another one would be like, why was it important for Natsuko to have the baby in the dream world? I keep saying dream world because it's dreamy, but I think it's more supposed to be like an other world, other dimension. So I'll say here the magic world. And then also, why did she say she hates Mahito? Because what's interesting about this is, normally with these types of stories, you have the stepmom who gets together with the dad and then kind of hates whatever child the dad currently has, because in the story, I'm talking specifically about fiction, the mom will be jealous of the dad's previous partner and the ghost of this other mom. So she'll sort of hate the original child because they look like the original mom, and they're worried that whenever the dad sees the original child, it's actually reminding him of the original mom who she's competing with. So usually there's that sort of dynamic. But here, I genuinely feel like Natsuko was being genuine in being nice to Mahito when they first met, and every time she tried to sort of save him from the heron and all of that, when she shoots the bow and arrow and all of that. I didn't feel like that was her having a mask on and then her saying I hate you was a mask off moment. I genuinely thought she was being nice and welcoming and accepting of Mahito. So I was sort of baffled by her saying that she hates him in that moment, just because that sort of emotional drama of she secretly hates him and finally it's bottled up inside her so much that she can finally say it. That didn't really feel thematically resonant, especially because by the end of it, he still fully accepts her as his mom. And also beforehand, he was always very nice to her, because the other type of trope we see with this sort of setup is that the kid is mad at the stepmom because he thinks she's trying to erase his original mom, so he acts out a ton. And even though the stepmom's trying to be really nice, they keep being antagonistic. But that also wasn't the case. Mahito seemed to be very kind and nice and polite to his stepmom. So I'm left just a little confused by what was sort of going on with their whole relationship thing there. And then there's there's so much with the symbolism, like 3, what was in the tomb on that strange island, which seems similar to the Island of the Dead, because since Himi is alive in this world, it's not like that's the body of Himi. And so I almost wondered, though I don't know if this is, I haven't looked into any of this, but it almost made me wonder if that tomb in the beginning actually was where Natsuko was being kept, because we later see her being kept in this cold, dark, rocky, sort of cave-like area. So I wasn't sure if that was a weird where it was like, oh, he actually had been so close to her, but in order to get to her properly, he basically had to go like a super roundabout way, or if it just was an eerie island, which again could just have to do with sort of the subconscious whole vibe of everything. Also, like, what was up with that sort of weird like triangular hallway that shocked you? Like, they showed that I feel like 5 times, because right after the boy initially almost escapes and sees his dad, he goes back in, he goes through the weird triangle thing, but then he goes back further, then he has to go through it. We see the parakeets go through it, then they have to run through it again when they go to escape the world as it's falling apart. So like, what was that supposed to symbolize? And then this hallway led to this other weird room that had like Greek architecture. It had like the Greek pillars, but then the other half was empty, which I think also might be a reference to some old painting, but I can't remember what. But they always have to walk through that. I was just trying to get like a better sense of sort of the quote-unquote world building stuff, which then leads to the last big thing I want to talk about when it comes to sort of theories. So there's sort of a weird sort of like timeline thing where this almost has a degree of time travel in it, but it's not quite, because it's sort of a place outside of time. But at the same time, when they leave, they have to follow their original timelines that they're from and within. So Kiriko is an interesting character because she is a younger adult woman within the dream world, because we see during the main timeline she's extremely old by the time that Mahito meets her in the real world. But then at the end of the movie, she goes through the door with Himi, which makes sense timeline-wise, because say she's 30 here and Himi is, I have no idea, 10. Then Himi would have to grow up long enough to meet the dad, have Mahito, die in the bombing of the fire and all of that. So that would make Kiriko much older. So the question is like was Kiriko actually always in the time, like always in the dream world? Again, I know it's not actually a dream, but bear with me. But was she always in the dream world before Mahito enters? Like, was she always this sort of fisherwoman thing, then enters Himi's world, and like when she goes through the door with Himi at the end of the movie, is that her first time entering the real world? Or because when Mahito enters the tower, he goes with the heron and Kiriko is brought with them, but then we don't see her when Mahito enters the weird island of the dead until we see this younger version of her, but she's wearing the same robes that she was wearing when she was an old lady. So I don't know if it's that the old lady became younger within the other world and had sort of a memory wipe and thought that she was this sort of like fisherwoman smuggler type person, or is it that she was always in the dream world, then goes with Himi, and then gets old, later meets Mahito, and then goes back to the dream world technically, and then the dream world explodes, so then she leaves with Himi, and there's almost like a weird loop. Is she caught in a time loop? Does that make sense? And then also, since Himi has fire powers in the dream world / magic world, there's sort of something strange with that, in that like Mahito doesn't get powers when he enters the other world. So it's not like when you enter the other world, you suddenly have superpowers. So one could argue that Himi would maybe still have these powers in the real world, because when the heron enters the real world, he's still able to be like the sort of half man, half heron spiritual entity thing. It's not like when he's in the real world, he can only be a bird, and it's only when he enters the magical world that he's like personified. So if his powers can go back and like are consistent in both worlds, could we believe that Himi's powers are consistent in both worlds? Because she's not afraid of dying in the fire bombing, and then it is mentioned by the heron later on in her timeline that no one ever found her body and that she's still alive. So my only other question would be, is it possible that during the firebombing, Himi went back into the dream world and she's sort of also in a time loop? Although we hear from the older women servants that Himi at one point entered the tower and then returned without any memories. But that would be the first time she returns, which is what takes place at the end of the movie. That's when she returns, because she returns to her timeline. So is it possible that then she grows older? Then the firebombing happens. She re-enters the dream world, but as a younger girl, because that would explain why the old lady became a younger, like, fisherwoman when she entered the dream world. I wish I had a better way of articulating all of this. I hope you guys are able to follow this, because like these are genuine questions I have, and I would love answers to them, or at least to hear your theories of answers to them. So yeah, with all that being said, I think I'm going to more or less wrap this up. This is sort of a strange movie. Like I said, it was sort of like only a little bit after I actually stepped out of the theater. I almost feel like I started to forget details pretty quickly, because it's such a sort of strange movie in this sort of subconscious stream of consciousness sort of imagery. So I'd love to hear some theories and hear what your guys, what you thought of the whole film, and if you have any other theories or questions, if there's anything else that stood out to you as strange, I'd be super interested to hear that. So with that being said, I think I'm going to wrap this up, so I will see you in the next one.